Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon and for the opportunity to discuss some of the rural infrastructure challenges in Africa and how they relate to the whole agricultural development agenda. This presentation is drawn from the Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic, which has been a major knowledge program that's been going on for the last 2 to 3 years, and which grew out of the Glen Eagles G8 Summit in 2005 and the formation of the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa. At that time, there was a big political commitment to scale up funding for African infrastructure, but at the same time, there was a recognition that our knowledge base was very sparse on these sectors and that there needed to be a commensurate effort to better understand the infrastructure situation. So a number of development partners came together to put together a fund of resources, and the World Bank was delegated the responsibility of implementing this program. And we've worked with a huge number of external partners, notably among them IFPRI, of course, who has been leading all the work on irrigation that I'll be touching upon. The AICD is really a very holistic view of Africa's infrastructure situation. It covers 24 countries. It covers 5 infrastructure sectors: ICT, irrigation, power, transport in all its aspects, water and sanitation. And it covers 3 aspects. It looks forward to say what are the investment needs over the next 10 years. It looks backwards to say, well, how much have we actually been spending? What has been the resource envelope available for African infrastructure? And it looks at sector performance and institutional and regulatory frameworks. The project's also now being extended into a second phase, which will cover essentially the bulk of the remaining countries on the continent. So from this very large body of knowledge, we were asked to draw out what have we learnt about rural infrastructure in particular. So this presentation is a kind of synthesis of the rural infrastructure lessons that are emerging from this work. My presentation is organized as follows. First of all, I'll give a few stylized facts about rural development in Africa. Then I'll zoom in on the rural infrastructure challenge. And then I'll take you through each of the main production-oriented sectors, so roads, irrigation, ICT, and power. I've left out the water and sanitation sector, although we do have quite a lot of work on it, simply because the focus of this presentation is more on infrastructure as an enabling platform for agricultural productivity, which I believe would be the central interest of this group. So just to begin with a few of the stylized facts. There was quite a strong spatial dimension to a lot of the analysis that was done for the AICD. And in the process of developing that, we came up with a certain number of spatial categories, if you like, which we found that were useful in... sorry, I'm just trying to get a sense of them. Is this a wireless mouse? Is this... No, okay. Okay, maybe here? Yeah, okay. Spatial categories for analyzing the distribution of population. So in the case of the urban areas, we distinguish between megacities, intermediate cities, secondary cities, and peri-urban areas. And this distinction is not based on any kind of administrative classification, but on density bands, essentially. And in the rural space, we distinguish between the rural hinterland, which is the area within 6 hours travel time of a city, and the remote rural areas. And what we see is if you take this classification, you find that about 2/3 of Africa's population is in these rural areas, but the bulk of those are in these rural hinterland areas, and a relatively small percentage are in these remote isolated settlements. And that carries across most of the different types of countries, although we find typically that in the landlocked countries there's a higher percentage of rural population overall. Africa remains a low-density continent. These are the densities that we find typically in each of these different zones of Africa. And what is particularly striking to us was how low density the urban areas were. If you look at some of the major Asian cities, you can easily get into densities of 10, 20, even 30,000 people per square kilometer. Whereas even in Africa's mega cities, we're talking about relatively modest population densities. So we began to sort of think of the rural area as being somehow divided between this rural hinterland area, which is centered around the urban population, and then these deep rural areas. And what you find is that 85% of the crop production and 50% of the rural population are in these rural hinterlands, and only 15% of the population and about 14% of the crop production are in these deeper rural areas. Now, what's interesting about this is that it clearly illustrates the kind of virtuous circle between urban and rural development, because essentially as the urban areas grow, which is exactly what's happening in Africa at the moment, expanding at about 3.6% per year, basically there's a surplus demand for food, which is met increasingly by the rural populations in these areas here, who are essentially coming out of subsistence agriculture and creating a surplus that's available for trade with cities. And these are the numbers that support that based on work by Paul Dorosh and others, but you can essentially see here how the crop production is concentrated in that band within a medium travel time to the cities. As we would expect, the rural populations show lower income and higher poverty rates, substantially different to the urban populations. And in terms of GDP, we looked a little bit into the whole debate about where the GDP is being generated. And this is very difficult because you can't always assume that agriculture is rural and you can't always assume that industry and services are urban. But if you take that very crude first-order approximation, you find that the rural sector, as represented by agriculture, contributes about 20% of the continent's GDP, but over 60% of the population. So those are just some introductory stylized facts. We now get into the whole issue of how, what the nature of the challenge of providing rural infrastructure. And what we find is that the high cost and low affordability and limited investments in rural infrastructure amplify the challenge of developing networks in these areas. Some of the main findings. First of all, infrastructure coverage as of today in urban areas is between 5 to 10 times higher than in rural areas. But even in urban areas, those rates are pretty low by global standards. We looked a lot into the relationship between infrastructure development and population density, and we tried to develop a kind of cost curve that shows how infrastructure development increases with declining population density. I'll show you that in a little while. Even if you allow for appropriate technologies that would make rural infrastructure more cost effective, you still face a major affordability challenge in the rural areas when you take into account both low population density and low income. We find that 1/3 of rural infrastructure needs rehabilitation compared with 1/4 in non-rural infrastructure, highlighting the magnitude of the maintenance challenge. And then historically, we find that about 20% of investment in infrastructure has been channeled to rural space. But if we look at the investment needs going forward, which we estimate to be around 20 billion a year for rural areas, about 40% of that would need to go into rural space. So now I'm just going to detail a little bit more each of those points. Here you can see the relative access rates of urban and rural areas to a range of different network infrastructures, and the gap is very evident, as I indicated earlier. In this chart, we show the results of trying to model infrastructure rollout costs as a function of density. And so in the chart, you have the low density areas in the rural space over here, and then here you have increasing density. And the orange line essentially takes a standard infrastructure package and says, what if we took that standard infrastructure package and we put it in the middle of Shanghai, what would that cost per capita? And the answer is around about $400. What if we took the same package all the way out into the rural areas of Burkina Faso, and it would cost about $4,500 to provide the same package? Now, of course, in practice, you would never provide the same package, right? Because you would use different technologies in rural areas than in urban areas. But the orange line is just there to illustrate how sensitive infrastructure provision is to density of population. And how that sort of rises exponentially as you get into the rural space. Another point to note is that this is the boundary between rural and urban space in terms of population density. This is the boundary between African urban space and urban space in other parts of the world, where you can see that even in African cities, costs of infrastructure are quite high compared to, say, some of the high-density Asian cities. But getting back to my other point about technology, in fact, in rural areas, we can typically provide a lot of infrastructure services without networks by using on-site technology like boreholes or latrines, etc. And so when we take that into account, we have the lower curve, which is the variable quality, where you allow sort of simpler solutions to kick in as you get into lower density areas. When you do that, you find actually that there isn't such a difference between the cost of a typical rural infrastructure package and a typical urban infrastructure package. And in some ways, the highest cost is the sort of low-density towns where you may still need networks, but you have a low density at which to roll them out. We then did the calculation in terms of affordability. If you take that variable quality package and you estimate the cost per hectare of servicing urban or rural space, and then you divide it by the purchasing power per hectare, i.e. the household budget multiplied by the number of people per hectare, you get a kind of spatial affordability coefficient. And this is what it looks like across urban to rural space. So essentially, in the urban areas, you are typically at less than one household annual budget to finance an infrastructure package. And in the most dense areas, you're well below that. Whereas in the rural areas, even using on-site technologies and lower cost appropriate technologies, it would take about 3 years or 4 years of a household budget to be able to afford an infrastructure package. And that's clearly beyond what could be contemplated. This chart simply illustrates the point about rehabilitation in rural areas. The fact that in general, rural infrastructure here in pink has a much higher rehabilitation rate than non-rural infrastructure, which is just an indication of the institutional challenge of maintaining infrastructure in rural areas. We then we looked at all of our evidence that we had amassed on historic spending on infrastructure, and we tried to apportion it between urban, rural, and national infrastructure. Now, that's not a precise science, so these are very much estimates. But this is the way that it looks. So you can see, for example, the rural is in dark red. So you can see that rural has attracted hardly any of the historic investment in power, ICT, and transport, but has attracted quite a high share in water, sanitation, and irrigation. And if we look ahead, we see in terms of the remaining investment agenda, you see that the dark red part of the curve has increased dramatically, meaning that there would be a shift. A lot of the unfinished infrastructure agenda is in the rural areas. Key message number 2. If we look at roads now, we find that the cost of improving the current low levels of rural accessibility rises exponentially as you try and reach more and more of the rural population. Right now, 1/3 of rural Africans have access to an all-season road, compared with 2/3 in other parts of the world. But if we wanted to reach all rural Africans and put them within 2 kilometers of an all-season road, which is ostensibly the aspiration of IDA and of the development community, you would have to actually quadruple the length of the existing classified road network in order to reach these people, which is obviously a big proposition. If you wanted to get to a rural access index of 50%, it would cost $5 billion per annum. If you wanted to go up to 75%, it would take $11 billion per annum. Therefore, if we're going to, we will likely need greater selectivity in developing rural road networks. And one way of prioritizing rural road investments is to look at the agricultural value of land and try and prioritize those investments. Probably only about 10% of these roads would be in high-value ag areas. And if you wanted to just service the high-value ag areas, it would cost only $1 billion per annum. Finally, there's evidence that the quality of rural road networks is benefiting from national reforms such as fuel levies and road funds. So just to detail some of those points, here you see the Rural Accessibility Index for these different countries, and this is based on spatial analysis, not on household surveys, which is the more typical way of calculating this index. You can see the variation there across countries. And here you see the quality of the rural road networks in those countries. You can see that the group of countries in pink on the left are countries that have road funds that allocate a substantial share of road fund revenues to rural networks. And in particular, allocate about 1.5 cents per litre of fuel to rural road network development. We find countries that are managing to allocate more than 1.5 cents per litre to rural network maintenance are doing substantially better. About 36% of their rural roads are in good condition, compared with only 22% for countries that are not managing to allocate those levels of resources. So although these national road funds were ostensibly designed for maintaining interurban networks, to the extent that countries are using them to channel resources in towards rural networks, it does seem to be having an impact in terms of rural road quality. This is the cost of, this is the relationship between the Rural Accessibility Index here on this axis And these are the thousands of kilometers of all-season road that you need to meet different levels of the target. So as of today, we're around about here at around 1/3 of Africans with access and around 300,000 kilometers of all-season road on the continent. And as I mentioned, if you wanted to get all the way up to 100%, you see how the curve gets steeper and steeper, and you need more and more kilometers in order to be able to reach the population. Turning to the irrigated area, I'll be drawing here on work that was done by colleagues at IFPRI. And their finding was that a doubling of the current irrigated area looks to be economically viable for Africa, because one thing is, of course, the physical potential for irrigation, and the other thing is the economic potential. As of now, irrigation is currently confined to a handful of African countries, but the 4% of land that's irrigated seems to be producing 20% of the agricultural value, showing the importance in terms of impact. There is a major potential for economically viable expansion, but that viability is highly sensitive to what we assume about storage costs per hectare, and we'll illustrate that shortly. The bulk of the potential irrigation actually lies in small-scale schemes rather than in large-scale schemes. But the investments needed are huge compared to existing levels of agricultural spending in the countries. So to actually harness that potential would take a big increase in agricultural spending and a big shift towards irrigation. So let's look at some of the details. Here's just some overview statistics on the share of cultivated area equipped for irrigation in different parts of Africa and the share of the potential realized. So you can see that it's 18% in sub-Saharan Africa versus 67% in Asia. Also striking is the relatively low rates of annual expansion of irrigated area during the last few decades. In terms of the distribution of this land, you can see here in brown the current irrigated area. So there's hardly anything to see, but you can essentially see South Africa, Sudan, and Madagascar as being where the bulk of the irrigated area is. In orange, you have the hectares that were identified as suitable for small-scale irrigation, and in black, the ones that are suitable for large-scale irrigation. You can see the distribution of those across countries. Here are the actual calculations. What we find is that based on unit costs of $3,000 per hectare, large-scale dam-based irrigation could be extended to 2.5 million hectares. Remember that today we have 6 million hectares irrigated in Africa. 2.5 would be suitable for extending dam-based irrigation. And this is based on dams that are likely to be developed in the next 10 years for hydropower, because this $3,000 per hectare does not make any contribution to dam storage costs. It purely represents the costs of distributing water to agricultural land. If you were to increase that to cover some of those storage costs, say to increase it to $6,000 per hectare, the viable hectares would shrink from 2.5 million to 1.8 million, so it's fairly sensitive. And the average rate of return on these investments is around about 16%, and you can see the variation across different areas of Africa. In terms of small-scale irrigation, the assumption was $2,000 per hectare of costs, and that gives you a potential increase in irrigated area of 10 million hectares, and this is restricted to hectares that have market access conditions. So we're not just looking at hectares anywhere, we're looking at hectares that have the agroecological potential but also have proximity to roads and market infrastructure. Now, if you raise that unit cost from $2,000 to $5,000 per hectare, your viable hectares shrink from 10 million to 42,000 only, and they're all in South Africa. So this is a highly, highly sensitive thing. And the cost of developing those 10 million hectares would be about $20 billion. Notice that in general, the internal rate of return on the small-scale schemes works out as being higher than on the large-scale schemes, even though we haven't included the storage costs in the large-scale calculations. This just is a graphical representation of where these hectares are, the green ones being small-scale and the blue ones being large-scale. But you'll see there's a particularly strong concentration in Nigeria, and from the earlier chart you'll recall that was where most of the bulk of the potential seems to lie. Some additional modelling done by colleagues at IFPRI looks at the impacts of such a scenario where we might be able to double irrigated areas in Africa within a reasonable period. And the main finding was to do with climate change. Essentially, if you look at the numbers here in bold, you'll see that with climate change, the number of malnourished, with no additional irrigation, but with climate change, the number of malnourished children rises to 33 million by the year 2050. But if you have climate change but an aggressive irrigation policy, the increase is, it goes only to 31 million, which is about the same as you would have with no irrigation and no climate change. So essentially, irrigation on the kind of scale that we're discussing is roughly what's needed to offset the food security impacts of climate change. That's one way to look at it. The other impact that comes out, of course, is the reduction in net cereal imports under an irrigation scenario, which is quite dramatic versus without. Turning to ICT, rural ICT coverage is already a reality ripe for further exploitation. Whereas in the other sectors we're sort of bemoaning the fact that infrastructure isn't there in the rural areas, in ICT we have infrastructure already. And the question really is, are we getting enough value out of it for the agricultural sector? About half of the rural population in Africa already lives within range of a GSM signal and rising very, very rapidly. And providing a GSM signal to the rest of the population would only cost about less than $1 billion per annum over the next decade, which when you put it alongside the kind of price tags that we had for the roads and the irrigation, it looks like pretty affordable stuff. And in a suitable regulatory environment, 0.6 of that 0.8 billion could actually be funded by the private sector, and leaving only about 5% of the population that would need public subsidy. Now, the GSM signal has major potential to distribute information products to the agricultural sector, price data, weather forecasts, extension services, etc. You probably know much more than I do about the extent to which that is being capitalized, but my sense is that this is perhaps an area where infrastructure still could contribute more than it is today, given that the infrastructure is already there. Here you just simply see the percentage of the population within range of the GSM signal against time, and you can see that it was almost zero in 1998, and it's 90% in 2006, and that the rural population has shared in that gain to quite an impressive extent. And if you want to see that spatially, this is the GSM footprint in 1999, basically nothing outside of South Africa and Morocco, and this is the GSM footprint in 2006, so you can see the magnitude of the change. On a country-by-country basis, this shows the extent to which universal access could be provided by the private sector alone. And you'll see that the red areas show the extent of existing coverage. So you have countries like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, where more than 90% of the population is in range of a signal already. And the yellow area is the part of the market that could be covered by the private sector if all regulatory hurdles were dismantled. And the little black area here is the part that would need public subsidy. So in most countries it's negligible, few noteworthy exceptions, countries such as DRC, for example. And this is spatially where those areas are. So the gray areas are the efficient market gap, the one that can be covered by the private sector, and the black areas are the areas that would need subsidy, and they're mainly in Sudan, DRC, Madagascar. They did a more sort of exploratory exercise for broadband coverage based on essentially public access, telecentre type of facilities for broadband. And we're surprised to find that even with this, the area of commercially viable broadband expansion was relatively high. Finally, the power sector, and this is probably the most depressing part of the story, because here we really do have a long way to go before rural areas can be electrified on any significant scale. As of today, rural access to power in Africa is only 12%, and it's expanding by only 0.5% per year. The national power networks are in a state of crisis with supply shortages and very high costs. And so basically Africa is struggling to supply electricity in its urban areas, let alone rolling it out into the rural areas. And we find that's important because we find quite a strong correlation between urban and rural electrification, suggesting that there is a sort of sequential effect there of having to get your national power system straight and reaching a sort of critical mass of power infrastructure before going out into rural areas. In many countries, half of the rural population lives more than 50 kilometers from a substation, which basically means that they are many years away from network rollout. We do find, however, as in the case of roads, that the countries that have rural funds, rural electricity funds, are doing somewhat better at rolling out rural access. So this is just the famous satellite picture, which I think tells the story more eloquently than anything else. This is Africa by night. And these are the actual rural electrification rates in the different countries. You can see a handful of countries, South Africa, Nigeria, Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, that have made significant inroads on rural electrification, and then a huge tail of countries down here, which are really less than 5% rural access. Here you can see the relationship between growth in rural access and growth in urban access, suggesting that there's a strong correlation between the two. And here we try and divide up the rural populations among the countries according to their distance from power infrastructure. So the ones that are in black are close, less than 10 kilometers from a substation, and could be electrified in a relatively short period. The diagonal stripes are the ones that are very, very remote, more than 50 kilometers from a substation. So that gives you a feeling in terms of different countries of how formidable the rural electrification challenge is. If we would map this back to our framework of rural hinterland and deep rural areas, we find that around 40% in the rural hinterland is within range of the trunk infrastructure, and only 10% in the deep rural areas. In this chart, again, we divide the countries between those that have rural electrification funds. Actually, I think there's a mistake in this chart. But anyway, the countries that have the rural funds are expanding essentially the rural access substantially faster than those that do not.